everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
Today, we're going to display a little bit of turtle power. We're going to cover the theatrical Ninja Turtles films. You know, this is another one where we made a call of just like, if we tried to cover all Ninja Turtles media, it could just be the entire podcast. We could just do a Ninja Turtles podcast, probably.
Yeah, like even the comic book itself has a really interesting history from like the fallout between the writer and artist to like where it is now. But we just wanted to focus mainly on the movie because like kind of weirdly guided the franchise for quite a while.
We're going to give a little context though. In 1984, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird created Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from their independent Mirage Studios, located in New Hampshire. You don't hear that often for publishing. And it was largely a parody of Frank Miller comics from the time. A lot of Ronin in there, most predominantly Daredevil. If you haven't ever thought of this before, Daredevil has the hand, the Ninja Turtles have the foot.
I never thought of that. I'm one of those idiots.
Chemicals drip down into the sewer, presumably after they had blinded Matt Murdock and created the Ninja Turtles. There's a bunch of little nods like that. And also the name itself was a big parody of everything that was popular at the time. Teenage being New Mutants and the Teen Titans. Mutant being, X-Men, New Mutants, all of that. Ninja being pretty much everything Frank Miller was writing. And Turtles being, the kicker. The comic does exceptionally well for an independent comic. First printings of those, even like later printings from that original run, are really expensive. They were quick to hook up with licensing agent Mark Friedman. And by 1986, they were already producing some merchandise. And in 1987, Eastman and Laird would meet up with Playmates who were looking to get their sort of Masters of the Universe G.I. Joe type line off the ground. And they thought Ninja Turtles would be a great place to start. And that's really kind of where all of what we know of Ninja Turtles begins. A lot of what the animated series was really to promote the toys, as most animated series were at that time. And a lot of the characters that actually became more familiar start kind of showing up there a little more formed.
Just like the fact that originally none of them had like special bandana cutoffs. That was like a cartoon invention. Just like a lot of small things that are kind of iconic now weren't in the comics originally.
Their personalities certainly were more developed by the cartoon. Regardless of the massive success of the toy line and the animated series, getting a film off the ground was not the easiest pitch. One of the things that was referred to pretty frequently at the time was the complete failure of the Masters of the Universe film after He-Man and the Masters of the Universe had been an insane success in toy stores. The amount of toys they were moving, I don't think has ever been equaled by any other line. And that movie, took a huge nosedive.
But they changed so much for that movie too. Like that was really caught in production hell.
Yeah, that's a whole story too. If you guys want a Masters of the Universe film episode, let us know. I'd love to do that. I think coming Masters of the Universe material, it might be an opportune moment as well. But regardless of all of this difficulty surrounding the production, people still did want to make the film. Thomas K. Gray of Golden Harvest Films, a very small company, started pursuing the idea when Bobby Herbeck, who was a writer and comedian, approached him with the idea to make the film. Around the same time, Gary Proper, the manager for Gallagher, apparently had also pitched a film version that would have starred Gallagher, John Candy, and two other comedians as versions of the Turtles. That's the first I'd ever heard this when I was doing this research, and I was like, well, I kind of want to see that movie. But Mark Friedman turned that down. Eventually, Kim Dawson would come on board to help produce with Thomas Gray from the basic idea from Herbeck, realizing that ultimately, to make an effective film of this, you really just needed to dress up some stuntmen and have them fight to really get what people wanted out of it. And she sort of gave it the go-ahead because of that she figured, even if it was a disaster, they wouldn't be spending the type of money that you would be on like a Masters of the Universe film.
No, yeah, the most expensive things is like the costume. And when I was rewatching this, like I was surprised by how cheap it kind of looks because a lot of it's just kind of like in a dark set, and you can tell like, oh, they're just trying to hide like literally everything besides the costume.
Yeah, I mean, it was a Jim Henson Productions production. He was doing the special effects on that, and it was something that Henson had directly worked on. He would die shortly after that. The last thing that Henson had produced before his death is actually the Muppets Go to Disney World, which is something I want
Oh,
desperately on Disney Plus. But they went into production without distribution. They were getting turned down by everyone. And a lot of companies that were interested in working with the franchise thought this movie was just like box office poison and wouldn't touch it. I think it's important to remember, too, we're not too far out from Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, which are now legendary, but did not perform incredibly well at theaters. You know, to speed ahead a little bit here, New Line Cinema decides to pick the film up for distribution. New Line seemingly having an eye for many, many years for films that no one wanted that were huge successes. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is shot on a $13.5 million budget and would gross $202 million at the box office. It remained the highest grossing independent film until 1999's The Blair Witch Project. This is like a huge movie, and we have to do that little bit of inflation too, thinking about how much money this movie actually made. By the time it went into production, it was a little different than that original pitch. While the screenplay does get a credit from Bobby Herbeck, Todd Langen had taken over the script because essentially whatever the implication from my research is whatever Herbeck wrote was unfilmable.
Unfilmable? How?
I couldn't find much on it, and I found like these indications that there was some kind of newspaper story around the time that went into it a little bit, and I could not find that story online. And trying to contact small papers in Canada probably isn't really going to get us too much. But Todd Langen, who had written for the Wonder Years, comes on and really tightens the script. The general consensus is the movie that made screens is Langen's movie. He also had a really good understanding of the original comics, but he wanted to pour in some of the attitude and fun that pops up in the animated series.
Like I said, it's a very dark film just to look at, but there's a lot of like wacky hijinks in it. Like the first I think 10 minutes they're just chasing after a pizza.
Yeah, it's it has that sort of wink from the cartoon while still somehow maintaining a very like Frank Miller aesthetic, which I think is kind of cool because that, you were saying that, a lot of the way they hid the problems with the special effects was that darkness that's kind of always surrounding the Turtles. But it's also effective because it feels very much like that late 80s, early 90s New York thing where like that movie kind of looks like way more serious movies, which I think helps it a lot.
Yeah, it's a very like Sin City vibe, which is what, yeah, like we said, the Turtles were pairing originally.
Again, it looks like a crime movie. Like it doesn't look like a superhero movie. It doesn't even look like Batman. It looks like for some reason there are giant turtles running around New York City, and New York City looks totally normal.
It's weird, but I quite enjoy this film too. Like even like when they get to the shredder and everything, it gets a little slow in the middle when like Casey Jones starts to show up, but you kind of have to have Casey Jones in a Turtles movie.
Yeah, and I think Casey Jones is a good grounding character for it. I think he's another step in that connection to the real world. Well, because he gets to feel a little more realistic while all this is going on, and it helps you forget that you're watching a bunch of giant turtles and a giant rat like fighting.
But those costumes are excellent. They're like even the robotic mouths and everything. They're like that's impressive even now.
That brings me to sort of something else that I think it's overlooked, is that this is directed by Steve Barron, who's not a big name in theatrical releases. His next biggest film is probably Coneheads. But what isn't recognized is Steve Barron directed some of the most influential music videos of the 80s. He directed Money for Nothing from Dire Straits. He directed Billie Jean from Michael Jackson. And he directed Take On Me from Aha. All of these are kind of experimental, and I think that's why the Turtles end up looking so good in this movie, is you have a director who's going to be thinking about all these weird details because that's sort of his thing. And him working with the Henson crew, I think, is probably invaluable to this production. That it just, Todd Langan laid the groundwork and made something that you could shoot. Something, with giant turtles that you could shoot on a decent budget. But without Barron and the effects team, I mean, this movie could have been a complete disaster.
Yeah, it could have been Masters of the Universe Part 2. It just like another chain of disasters. And that like it completely misses the point of like what people like about this franchise and like totally gets all the designs wrong and everything. But they were really clever about just like focusing on what people want to see and trying to make it feel like grounded and realistic, because you think like watching 4 people in giant turtle costumes would be impossible to watch, but it's not, which is an achievement in of itself.
We're ragging a lot on Masters of the Universe, and I love Masters of the Universe for what it is. It obviously, to have really replicated what the cartoon was and what the implications of the comics and everything were, yeah, that's a different movie. This movie manages to do what it should do, which is to make you believe that these turtles exist somehow in this real world.
Yeah.
Great cast too. Judith Hoag as April O'Neil, Elias Koteas as Casey Jones, James Saito as the Shredder, Toshishiro Obata as Tatsu, who, when I was a kid, was one of my favorite characters who, like, I wish they had done more with in other media. Brian Tochi voicing Leonardo, Corey Feldman, the incomparable Corey Feldman, as Donatello, Josh, and I apologize if I butcher this, Pius as Raphael, Robbie Riss as Michelangelo, Kevin Clash, better known for his work as Elmo, was Splinter, which I had no idea about that. David McCarran voicing the Shredder, Michael McConey voicing Tatsu, and I think is really funny, Sam Rockwell, Skeet Ulrich, and Scott Wolf were all young thugs in this film.
This is a weird cast.
It's an interesting cast, right? It's an independent film that happens to also be a superhero film, which I think is it's part of the reason why I don't think the feel of this movie has ever been recaptured.
I think it has a lot to do with like the industry as a whole too, because budgets have just like blown out of control at this point. Like Deadpool 1 cost like $200 million to make, and like that's an insane budget to think about. And this was made for, you said, 13 million, right?
Yeah, 13.5, yeah.
Which is like that's a shoestring budget now, and it's just kind of interesting to see like how different the industry has become now. Where like back then you could have these independent like superhero, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are superheroes, right? Or are we saying comic book?
Yeah, I think we're going to kind of get into that discussion of what superhero means as we go on. I was thinking that this is really the Ninja Turtles' relationship with their audience is a really good example of something that's a little different than what we're kind of defining as like normal superhero aesthetic now.
To see like nobody being willing to take a risk on something like this, even though it's massively successful, is indicative of the industry now and then.
I think it has a lot to do with, what we were talking about, that look, that dark look. I think a lot of parents who went in there thinking they were going into a kid's movie kind of came out and were like, oh, that was actually really good. And passed that information along that, you could go into this movie and, as ridiculous as the base premise is, they do everything in their power to make it less ridiculous. You have Raphael going through psychological trauma. Like, the violence feels pretty real in the first one. And, as we were saying, it feels like that era New York.
Yeah. I don't know how much of our audience remembers New York before Disney took over Broadway, but it was it was pretty dirty. It did kind of look like that back.
Yeah, and it's definitely, that pre like LED world where like everything was a little darker. And I always felt like one of the big changes that's happened in my lifetime is like offices used to be like dingy because everyone was like smoking. And now like offices are like, oh, look, we have like an arcade downstairs. Like this is like a totally different like vision of New York. It's also like a fairly reasonable level of action. Most of the action centers around the fact that the Foot Clan have been recruiting teenagers to do petty crimes for them to help support their criminal empire so they can eventually kind of destroy everything and take everything in the city. A large portion of the plot is the capture of Splinter and the Turtles going to rescue him. There's no big set pieces. There's no crazy technology. It is believable as it could be, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot of alleyways, rooftops, and sewers. Doesn't get more varied than that. Maybe you get a park scene or two. That's about it.
Yeah, there's like the upstate New York part. Yeah, you get some trees. You get April sketching the turtles, which I think is this bizarre, like, I don't know. It almost feels like it should be meta, but there's like nothing really to support that. It is an interesting movie, and like, there is nothing that it really ever replicated it.
Right. This came out before Power Rangers, right?
Yeah, right before. It would have been, I think Power Rangers is 93. So this would have been about 3 years before Power Rangers. There wouldn't have been a real precedent for quite a while of live action superheroes that were aimed for kids, which it's funny. This movie is totally appropriate for kids and yet still works for adults. So obviously, we were talking about how big of a success this is. This is Hollywood. Sequel gets greenlit real quick. And by real quick, I mean the movie is out within a year. I think it's 8 days, less than a year since the release of the first movie. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze, comes out on March 22nd, 1991, where the first movie had only come out on March 30th, 1990. $25 million budget, so a little less than double, but makes $78.6 million at the box office. Not the blowaway hit of the first one. We can kind of get into maybe why that is. Directed by Michael Pressman, pretty prolific television director. Once again, written by Todd Langen. Big change, Paige Turco takes over as April O'Neil. Judith Hoag, by her own admission, said that she was pretty miserable on set of the first one, and she understands why they didn't want to bring her back.
And that's interesting. What, did she just not like talking to giant turtles?
She said it had a lot to do with the scheduling, that it was a very tight schedule because it was a smaller production. She was working like 6 days a week. And also, they were trying to really closely replicate the clothing and look of April from the cartoon, which if you watch the movie, they absolutely did not. And she was very frustrated with kind of like the hoops they were making her jump through, like makeup, hair-wise. And she feels that she kind of accidentally burned that bridge and understands why they didn't bring her back. Returning, most of the cast does return. Brian Tochi, once again, Leonardo. Robbie Rist, once again, Michelangelo. Adam Carl is going to take over as Donatello, replacing Corey Feldman. Not sure if there's a story behind that. I couldn't really track anything down. And finally, the one actor who actually portrayed both the physical and the voice for their turtle, Josh Pius, is replaced in the second film by Laurie Faso on the voice. Ernie Reyes Jr., who had worked as a stunt turtle, now plays Kino as a sidekick to the turtles. Voices come back for Shredder and Tatsu, though the Shredder is now played by Francois Chow in the suit. When he turns into the Super Shredder, he is portrayed by big sexy Kevin Nash, also known as Diesel, former WCW and WWF World Heavyweight Champion. I don't think he's actually credited, but it came out because wrestling fans are the most research heavy fans in the entire world, and at some point someone figured it out. Frank Welker, best known for his work as the voice of Megatron, will voice Toka and Razor, who are two mutants who are created by the Foot Clan, which is your first indication of where this movie starts to go.
This movie is interesting to me because I feel like it's more iconic than the first one, oddly enough, just because there's weirder scenes in this one, such as the infamous Vanilla Ice scene and the turtles start dancing. Very first scene where they're bopping each other, all those ninja clans with toys and things like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting change of pace, especially because it's the same writer. I think that's intentional. I think after the success of the first film, they were probably emboldened a little bit to, as much as I hate to say this, unify the brand, get a little closer to the cartoon in the films without, busting the bank up too bad. It's a cool story, and quite frankly, what can you do? This is like a horror movie where you have the first movie, you can play everything kind of cool, and you can play it as if it's really real, and then by the time you get to that second movie, you got to start explaining things, and that's what this is. It starts explaining the ooze. It starts explaining like how that might work.
It doesn't explain it well.
I mean, how can you explain it well? It doesn't really work, so.
Exactly. Like, I always find it strange when, like, comic book movies do this, where they go out of the way to explain, like, oh, yeah, this radioactive waste is from this company. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's like radioactive waste. I get it, initially.
I mean, they kind of, wrote Shredder back into things when it looked like he had been crushed to death at the end of the first one. Though that scene where he wakes up in the dump is, like, one of my favorite things ever.
Yeah.
Like, that's burned into my brain. Shredder, like, pissed off, waking up in the dump. And then when he comes back to the foot, they're like, oh, look at his face. And his face isn't that bad.
It's like a little fat scratches. It's like the Doctor Doom thing he's got going on. It's like a tiny scratches, all melodramatic about it.
Yeah, it's not like so harsh with like the movie before everyone was trying to kill each other with swords. Once again, just because of the time that it was written, not a ton out there on the development of the script. What I think is interesting is Toka and Erasar, the two other mutants. It has been confirmed from multiple sources that originally they wanted to do Bebop and Rocksteady from the cartoon. The explanation for that for years was that because of how smartly structured all of the merchandising deals were, and that's something to really like think about as we keep moving through this. Those characters weren't implicitly part of the package, was obtained to make the films. So the old explanation used to be that, Bebop and Rocksteady weren't part of the deal for the movie, so they didn't do it because they couldn't, have carte blanche with the characters. I would guess that means that the deal is probably more based off the comics, which would make sense thinking about the script for the first movie. But in more recent years, Peter Laird has come out and said that he didn't want them in the second movie. He wasn't a really big fan of those characters. Bebop and Rocksteady were created when they were making the toy line, and while Laird and Eastman were involved in that process, they were just throwing out as many ideas as they possibly could to fill up that toy line. And they really didn't like the characters on the cartoon. They thought they were kind of like goofy and thought that would hurt the movie. So they didn't want them in there. It's probably somewhere in between the two. I would guess more that it's Eastman and Laird had to sign off on it and they wouldn't. This is all like little speculation, just taking what, they've said and how these things tend to work. But I would guess it was something like that. But then you end up with Toka and Razar, which I think are great. I think it's really funny, but they're supposed to be like infants. And I don't understand how that's an improvement on characters being stupid.
I think it's even worse too, because I remember watching this and being like, well, Bebop and Rocksteady, and that they look a little different. And then I actually watch it, they're not Bebop and Rock.
Like you knew it was supposed to be Bebop and Rocksteady. Like,
yeah,
those are the next two. Like those are the two big ones on the bad guy side, and that's who should have been in the movie, and it wasn't. And it's interesting that Toka and Razar now have like their own fan base, but the fact that decision was made to like, because it was too stupid in the middle of a movie where, like, as you were saying, the Ninja Turtles are beating people up in like the middle of toy stores and stuff. Like it seems kind of like a ridiculous comment to make.
No, I agree too. Like kids pick up on these things. Like I picked up on it, and it's just like I think if you're trying to like consolidate a brand, which they were likely doing here, it's always seems like a lot of movies in the '90s did this, where they kind of just like veered off of like the source material for no reason, and just came up with a worse idea overall. And it's just like, why didn't you just go with the original idea?
Oh, well, in the 90s might not be, a completely appropriate one for this franchise as we move forward. But Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, as we said, made a good amount of money. It's still pretty well liked. I know I enjoy it. It's not the first one, and nothing regains that tone. I think a big part of that is that this one, the Turtles are better lit. This was still done under the Jim Henson Company, but Jim had passed away a few months after the first film was released. It is dedicated to Jim Henson, which is interesting in itself. I wonder if he had worked anything on sort of pre-production on it, but, you know, the suits in the second one, I would say, are probably as good as the first, but that sort of darkness, that sort of beat upness of the first one is gone, and it exposes a little bit of the weaknesses. Like, you can, especially now in HD, you can see where the head is attached to the neck and that the neck doesn't look like skin. It gets a little weaker because they probably have a little more confidence.
But it seems like they're a lot more flexible too, because they're doing a lot more like kicking and punching and flips in them too. Like there's a lot more, it seems, aerodynamic.
Yeah, which I think is an interesting thing too, because I agree with that. Like the fight scenes in it are way more over the top than they are in the first one, which I also think is another aspect that changes the tone of this. Is the first one like felt a little reasonable when they were fighting. Like there are moments where obviously they have like the fun like comedic fighting moments, but this one is like all off the wall stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes literally jumping off of walls. It does well received, but they take a little more time to get the next one out. This is in part because of a lot of the crew changing, I would assume. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 comes out on March 19th, 1993. Sometimes called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Turtles in Time, not to be confused with like the greatest video game ever made. It has a budget of $21 million and ends up with a box office of $65 million. Not as big of a success as the first two, but certainly not a failure.
This is kind of where you end the first phase of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it's kind of appropriate to end here. There was a weird time period in like the 80s and 90s where like every 3 years there was like a new fad that was taking over. Turtles in Time is kind of a weird movie in of itself because it, like you mentioned, it sounds like that a really awesome video game, and you think, oh, they're going to be jumping all over time, and no, they're just in samurai times, and it's just kind of awkward.
It's an interesting script written and directed by Stuart Gillard. You know, most of these guys are doing a lot of TV and things. Stuart Gillard, I jumped out at me that he was also the director on Rocket Man, the Harlan Williams vehicle from the 90s, not the recent Elton John biopic. That would be a very different feel, I'm sure. Paige Turco returns as April. Elias Koteas returns as Casey Jones, which is cool. Brian Tochi makes the full three as Leonardo. Corey Feldman comes back as Donatello. Tim Keller as Raphael, and Robbie Rist comes back as Michelangelo. James Murray takes over duties for Splinter this time. As you were saying, it's not like a time travel movie where the Turtles get to go have fun in different eras, which probably would have been the coolest movie of the three. They exchange places with Samurai, which to me ends up being the most disappointing thing in the entire movie because they bring back Casey Jones and his job is babysitter of Samurai while they're stuck in the city.
Yeah, it's really lame. If you didn't like the two mutants from the last movie, you're not going to really like them just getting to wacky hijinks. I feel like it misses the point in that kids just kind of want to see these turtles fight.
And I will say this. Between 2 and 3, I think I actually like the fight scenes a little more in 3. They kind of go back because of the subject matter that they're supposed to be fighting against samurai. They tend to go back a little bit to more grounded fighting. There are still a ton of gags in this, don't get me wrong, but I thought that, if anything, was kind of my favorite thing in the movie. Turtles look noticeably different in this movie. The Henson Creature Shop did not work on it. It was handed off to All Effects Company. The turtles are a lot brighter. The head shape's a little different. The eyes are kind of weird. Doesn't quite look right, but I think the thing that sticks out to me most with those suits is there seemed to be far less attention to aligning the audio with the mouths. Though the mouths seem fairly complicated, they can make a lot of shapes as you're watching it. This seemed like less of a cohesive production than the first two.
Especially if you're changing over this many people. It's fine for the sequel because you kind of had the same special effects people to kind of guide everything together. But if you're switching like an entire special effects team, things get complicated really fast.
The design feels very different. It was it was always seen as kind of a failure even when I was a kid. I remember people talking about how much it failed, which isn't true. And there's a lot of these myths out there with a lot of movies. And, we try to always break those myths as we do these episodes. It did make money, but I think it did probably kill the franchise. I think you lost probably your entire adult audience on 3. Especially because they bring back Casey Jones, who is really like the anchor for the adult audience, and put him in a position where he's really not doing anything. The story of them, traveling back into time, into, feudal Japan is kind of pointless. Like, it doesn't feel like the other two. Like, at bare minimum, even though 2 is a lot goofier, it felt like a sequel to the first one. Like, it felt like you were learning more. This just felt like a strange distraction.
I think it has a lot to do with like how these turtles at this point aren't really characters. Like, arguably, they're very, very thin characters, so there's not like anything to explore after the second movie. Like, I think the second movie focuses so much on the ooze because, like, what do you explore about like Donatello or Michelangelo or any of these other characters? Like, there's not really any inherent conflict between their dynamics. I mean, there's some with Raphael being like kind of a sassy bitch, but that's about it. And it's not even like that sassy as he gets now, where he's like leaving the team like every single movie. So I think that's why they try to focus so much on like the ooze, and then once you're done with the ooze and the second one, like, what do you do? Like, you already did everything with Splinter twice. Like, so I think that's why this franchise, you see like them on its last legs in this movie.
I think you have a point there. Like, the Raphael arc is like the arc for Ninja Turtles. Like, it's same way that you can look at, Spider-Man, where people try to do the Green Goblin arc over and over again. It's the one that makes most sense because it then makes him the most interesting character. I think the solution would have been to create some kind of conflict with another character. The problem is part of the ending of the first one is the fact that they're now over their conflict. And to step back is always going to feel like a step back. I just don't think they really were even trying to do anything that intellectual on this. I think someone saw the video game and was like, oh, okay, they travel through time.
I think there's like a bunch of problem with that too. Like, yeah, they travel to time, but they don't really do that to their furthest potential. I do think it's interesting that it suggests they added another character. And like, from what I remember, the creators are very against like adding new members to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles at like any point.
Yeah, there is an exception to that in the
Well,
late
recently.
90s. But Ninja Turtles 3, as we said, makes money, but the franchise goes to sleep as far as theatrical for a while. The cartoon continues airing regularly until about 1996. Then it's, in syndication, etc. for a while. 2003, we get a newly branded Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is a really cool show and a lot darker, a lot more in line with the sort of post-Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, Lee Wald's era, where you get these action cartoons that are just a little more grounded and let your characters be more dramatic. Ninja Turtles gets a shot at that too in that 2003 series. That show runs for a good few years, really well liked amongst, older fans and younger fans, and creates a nice little bridge of fandom, if you will, for 2007's TMNT. That is an animated feature film, the first animated feature film coming from Imagi Entertainment, WB, and the Weinstein Company. Written and directed by Kevin Monroe, who is a veteran in the animation business. He had worked on Hey Arnold. A really comprehensive vision of where he wanted this to go. Your cast is made up largely of animation regulars. James Arnold Taylor, Nolan North, who's probably best known as Deadpool in pretty much every animated Deadpool thing. Mikey Kelly, Mitchell Whitfield. But they do throw in Chris Evans as Casey Jones, which adding another superhero to Chris Evans' already impressive catalog of superhero roles. Sarah Michelle Gellar as April O'Neil. Patrick Stewart plays a character named Max Winters, who has a secret that drives the film. This tends to lean a little bit towards the 2003 animated series. It has a lot of like sort of sorcery type things in it, but plays that action really heavy. It opens with the idea that the Turtles have broken up since their most famous adventures. Like, they talk about the Shredder, but the Shredder's gone, which is an interesting way to start the film.
think they did that mostly to help develop these characters because even though the 2003 series was more action oriented and more character driven, it didn't do a whole lot with developing their characters. A lot of it, there's like a lot of wacky hijinks. There's entire arcs where they're just going through time. Yosagi Jimbo shows up a couple of times. There's like a tournament arc. It's very like anime-esque. Like there's a lot of Dragon Ball influence, I think, on that too. Here, I think there was the focus a lot more of like creating the next generation, and a lot of that was trying to build up these characters from like the ground up. And the best way to do that was to have them like not be together.
Which I think is an interesting way to do it because, and this is something also that has popped up with this film. There's a little bit of a debate about the continuity of it. Obviously, this is a really accessible version of the characters to really anyone who is familiar with the original films or the 2003 series. Like, it doesn't feel wrong in either respect. But early on, they said this was kind of its own thing, and they were really using, the most well-known Ninja Turtles stories to drive the background. Monroe came out later and said it's a sequel to 1, 2, and 3. But there's something really cool about this is Monroe was like really committed to the project, and he wanted to do 2 more, and he had them outlined.
Oh wow! I would have liked to see those sequels. Mariah kind of an interesting addition to that. She has showed up before, but here she gets like a more romantic subplot with one of the turtles, which is like inherently weird. But I think it does develop the world they live in. There's a lot less about the city and pizza and things like that. And this is a movie that's like really trying to forge its own way with the franchise.
Yeah, and Monroe was like a really big fan of Karai, which I think is why she gets that spotlight. So for those of you who want to know where Monroe's other films would have gone, here's a little bit of an outline. TMNT 2 would have been a loose adaptation of City of War. Michelangelo feeling like he's not being taken seriously, runs away to join the Foot Clan. Turtles go to Japan to cross paths with Karai in another adventure, resulting in the return of the Shredder. He wanted Bebop and Rocksteady. He was getting like the same answers they got on the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2. But I think that's interesting from what we were saying before, that would have created some drama with a different character than Raphael. Things rapidly changed for the franchise after TMNT. In 2009, Nickelodeon purchases, and I'm trying to get the wording on this right because it's an interesting deal. They purchase all rights to the properties. So essentially, Nickelodeon at that point then somehow owns rights to every part of Ninja Turtles. So I guess they're now the controlling entity. But Nickelodeon, when purchasing the rights, immediately declares their intention to create a new live-action film. They're scheduling it for 2011. That does not happen. We'll get into some of that. Imagi Entertainment, which did TMNT, shuts down in 2010 after the failure of their Astro Boy.
I just remember Nicolas Cage was in that.
And now he's going to be the Tiger King. There's things to look forward to. So in late May of 2010, it was announced that Nickelodeon had brought in Michael Bay and his Platinum Dunes cohort to create the new Ninja Turtles live-action film. I don't hate Michael Bay. Immediately seems like a strange choice.
With the way you were explaining, like Nickelodeon immediately buying this property, this gives me like Disney Star Wars vibes, where they're just like, we just had to get something going immediately. We spent so much money on this. I can see why they picked Michael Bay because he was pretty hot shit off of the Transformers franchise, which is its own thing that I don't like. But I can see why they did that, just because, like, well, Michael Bay made one weird toy franchise successful. He can make it 2 toy franchises successful.
Yeah, that's that Hollywood logic where, like, 2 types of stories that are completely unrelated somehow become related. So, they go forward on this. Art Markham and Matt Holloway do a draft. Apparently that one dies pretty quickly. A year later, Josh Applebaum and Andre Nemec rewrite the script. They had both worked on Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. And this version of the script becomes quite infamous. It's referred to as the Blue Door because that's what it was being written under. And this ends up being confirmed in 2012 by Michael Bay that the Ninja Turtles in this are neither going to be Teenage Mutant Ninja nor Turtles.
Basically removes everything appealing about the franchise, as usual.
Not to get too deep into some of the terrible, terrible things I read, but essentially the Turtles would have been interdimensional beings who appeared as turtles, would not be teenage or mutant, and would be coming to our Earth essentially to stop a Krang invasion. Yeah, it literally takes anything that makes the Ninja Turtles out of it and just picks the weirdest thing you could possibly, like, hang your hat on.
Yeah, this was leaked as a script, right? Like a full script?
Yeah, the full script leaked, but even before the script leaked, it had kind of gotten out what they were doing. Around the same time that we're getting all these leaks and all this information, Jonathan Liebesman beat out Brett Ratner to direct the film. Yeah, we don't have to get into Brett Ratner's history at this point, but, not the most beloved figure in any respect at this point.
He's like a work for hire director. Like that,
Yeah,
to be demeaning.
Once again, just sort of this, as you were saying, let's get this thing off the ground type choices. That said, the studio does respond to the really horrifically negative response to what got out about that script. They bring in Evan Doherty, probably best known completed films, Divergent and Snow White and the Woodsman. But Doherty at that point had kind of become the go-to guy for old franchises they wanted to reboot. He did a pass on G.I. Joe. He wrote a Masters of the Universe script. He was around quite a bit in that couple of years. He comes in, works alongside Kevin Eastman a little bit, and they get the script to a place where they feel like is a good compromise on the story. So the film does go into production, is eventually released as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on August 8th, 2014. Briefly, it was just going to be called Ninja Turtles, which also wouldn't have been accurate with that script. They later said that the shortening was just to try to make it more marketable, and just a bunch of backtracking on that. Budget of between 125 to 150 million, makes 493.3 million, so it's a success.
It got oddly good buzz, but I think that was just because like what the original script was shown as, like people appreciated how much the studio backtracked on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You always wonder if that can really work, and maybe this is an example of it working. Yeah, they didn't backtrack 100% though. The turtles in this film are lab experiments. The ooze, we don't really know much about in the first film, but it's not a chemical that is being produced by anyone. We find out later. They kind of drop a lot of the real ties to like the samurai ninja mythology that they're building in the other ones. This is very much supposed to be a group of turtles and a rat who are influenced by reading a ninjutsu book and pop culture. I have a theory about this that, we went back to the beginning of this. Ninja Turtles was a parody, and we pointed out where that parody kind of starts, and that's a lot of the origin. I have this sneaking suspicion the reason this was done is because they wanted to move away from that parody origin and kind of ended up on this origin that was somewhere in between what they said originally and the original origin. Maybe an attempt to like distance it from any legal issues going forward. And then they kind of ended up with this weird like half-assed version of the origin. I don't know. It's certainly better than what that original script was going to do, but it's a little weird that it becomes this sort of, hey, this rat learned from a book. Like, it's just like, it's already stupid, and it seems to make it stupider.
Do you know how much involvement Nickelodeon had with this?
I would say that they had to be pretty involved. I mean, Paramount is the same company. It's all Viacom.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Shit.
I can't imagine that it wasn't, a cohesive effort, especially because, like we were saying, this looks like gun for hire work.
Yeah, it is interesting then you're pointing out that they're trying to like distance from the origins. I mean, the origins weren't a direct parody anyway. They were kind of like more of a weird what if than anything. Because it's not like about Daredevil, or it's not parodying Daredevil directly. It's more like a pastiche of several things.
Yeah, but I mean, there are those points that are real deliberate, like the foot and the hand and Splinter and Stick. It's, I could see a lawyer getting worried. But as you said, successful. Kind of a cool cast. Johnny Knoxville as Leonardo. That decision was made. Jeremy Howard as Donatello. Alan Ritchson as Raphael, which I think is a really cool choice. Ritchson would go on to be Hawk on Titans and is pitch perfect. And Raphael's not too different of an attitude. Noel Fisher as Michelangelo, he was Toad on X-Men Evolution. Tony Shalhoub as Splinter, which is just bizarre, but okay. Megan Fox as April O'Neil, which I think is actually completely inoffensive. I know people were like up in arms, but you know what? She worked with Michael Bay quite a bit. He's comfortable with her. I think she's fine in the movie.
I can see why people were upset because she's either has red hair or the yellow jumpsuit, and those are both the kind of the iconic look for her. But many of the movies strayed away from that at this point.
Yeah, I think the hair is already like a non-point, considering the actresses who portrayed her in live action before. They didn't have like super red hair. William Fichtner as Eric Sachs. Always great to see him in something. Tohru Masamune as the Shredder. This is a Ninja Turtles movie that's desperately trying to be a Marvel movie.
I mean, I don't really disagree.
I think in every like aspect of how the action is, and I think that's where this distortion is not every type of superhero story is the same, and they're trying to get the Turtles to fit a mold that they don't.
Yeah, I think the origin is also kind of besides the point for the Turtles, because more than most franchises, like the Turtles are usually about like the kung fu and the weird like how off the wall can you get with.
Yeah, it's not like a bad movie. Objectively watching it, like I don't watch it and like cringe at things. It's just it seems to exist for no reason. And the designs, as you had implied before, are a little off-putting. But that's like that weird challenge of, okay, you can either kind of do exactly what they did before, or you can try to make it look a little different.
Well, if you're changing them to all to like space aliens and stuff like that, why wouldn't you change the design? It seems like a lot of that is left over from that idea.
I would agree to a certain extent, especially because they're like 7 feet tall. But also, you can kind of see where you're like, all right, if you just said to a designer, like, do what you want, make a human-sized turtle, like, you're going to end up with stuff like that. And I always, like, as much as, like, I don't love the designs, I thought that the criticism on them was, like, bizarrely harsh. Like, I felt like if this movie had never come out and someone had put up a DeviantArt page with those designs, I would have seen it, like, 5 times 1 month, where everyone's like, yeah, this is what Ninja Turtles should look like.
You think so? I feel like...
No, I really do. I think that people had such a bad taste in their mouth from, like, the script leaks that they were going to, like, tear apart anything that popped up.
I guess that's true. Like there was a weird like 6-month period where like they just wanted anything that's different.
And it's like this weird internet effect where like in one respect it was probably positive with getting that script change. But you also just have like criticism being waged on things that you might not criticize if you hadn't already gotten worked up about something else.
It's at the Ben Affleck effect of, you know,
right.
Him being Batman and then suddenly everybody being okay with him being Batman because the next one's Robert Pattinson.
Yeah, and then once Robert Pattinson is great as Batman, we'll be mad about the next one. It's fine. As we said, a success. We go on to the sequel. 2-year turnaround on this, June 3rd, 2016. Probably needed a little longer. $135 million budget with a box office of $245.6 million. And in today's terms, that's short about $20 million of breaking even.
It's interesting to go from a movie that was $13 million to this much in about, 15 years?
Yeah, 10 times. 10 times the budget in 15 years, and it's the least successful of the 6.
Oof, that's hard. That's rough. This one's a bit goofier than the other one. I think they took a lot of the internet criticism from the first one and really tried to amp the hijinks up in this one. Just because, I think they were trying to really spin out a franchise out of this, much like what they did with Transformers and Transformers Prime. Because of that, I think they lost a lot of their focus, and that's why this one wasn't as successful, especially after the first one was kind of I don't want to say middling, but it was just serviceable. People didn't really have that same interest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there was a bit of a novelty to a new Ninja Turtles live-action movie in the first one that you lose in this. What I think is really funny is Josh Applebaum and Andre Nemec, whose script got shredded, come back as the only credited writers on Out of the Shadows. I have a distinct feeling that Evan Doherty outlined maybe 2-3 movies to follow that first one, because this seems very in line with the first one as far as what they start establishing about their origins. You go back to the sort of lab rat thing with Bebop and Rocksteady, who do finally get to appear, portrayed by Gary Anthony Williams and WWE superstar Sheamus. Also, another WWE champion fighting the Ninja Turtles. This one was directed by Dave Green, who had done Earth to Echo, which was a success. This was not as much of a success. Cast on the Turtles stays the same. Different Shredder, which is a little jarring if you watch them close together. Brian T does not look the same as Tohru Masamune, and it's very strange because I watched them in rapid succession, and while like the Turtles seemed like pretty much the same, like it was two totally different Shredders, like people. We get Tyler Perry as Baxter Stockman, which is great. I can't say anything bad about that. Brittany Ishibashi as Karai, who's becoming, a staple of the series. Stephen Amell of Arrow fame as Casey Jones. Great casting, really bizarre Casey Jones in the movie.
Like I said, I think a lot of this lost its own focus. It didn't really seem to be driven by anything besides that they wanted a franchise.
The thing I do appreciate it out of this film is we do finally get a live action, arguably, Krang, voiced by Brad Garrett, which is amazing. They really try to pump up a lot of the cartoon elements here with both Bebop, Rocksteady, Krang, the Technodrome are all involved in this. It just kind of by the end of it, once again, feels like, why did this movie happen? I guess the thing that I hold on to most whenever it's just like sort of on and I have it in the background is, the effects are cool. And like I said, you have those cartoon characters in it. I can't hate it because of that, because I do enjoy the fact that they finally made it onto screen. But this whole like continuity just seems so much less important than the first three. And I mean that. Even the third one. Like the third one still seems like kind of a more interesting movie than these.
I think also like it's because they muted a lot of the characters too, because they did try to go in that more action direction, and because of that, they didn't really have anything to build on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It is that very like light cartoony version of all of their characterizations, and while it carries over pretty well, and it definitely feels like the same characters in the first movie and the second one outside of Shredder, it's not characters you're necessarily all that invested in because they didn't give you a reason to be. So that bomb's pretty bad for a movie of that budget. 2 years later, in 2018, Platinum Dunes comes back and says they're rebooting. They had gotten Andrew Dodge, who had written Bad Words, to do a script. At the end of 2019, they were supposed to go into shooting, and that obviously did not happen. There's no director. There's nothing. I have a feeling this isn't happening.
You think it's just dead in water? I wouldn't be surprised. The franchise is so different at this point now.
And, like there's plenty of Ninja Turtle stuff for Nickelodeon to make money off of right now. I don't know where you go. Everything you do is going to look like you're trying to replicate the success of Marvel, which is exactly what they did try to do in those last two. They said they were going to be shooting at the end of 2019. None of this came to fruition. They don't have a director. Not much has popped up about any script. I think they're done for now. I think what we learned in the first two films is you got to keep it a little more contained. It's a little more of its own thing. You don't need super over-the-top action at all times for these stories to work, and that's all they're going to try to put into it, I think. And they have the animated series. They have lots of merchandise. Viacom is making money.
Anytime you make a movie out of a franchise, is like this implication implicitly that you're doing a Marvel movie. Like, fuck, this is going to be like a Scooby-Doo cinematic universe possibly now. Like, weird shit like that. It's just like, not everything has to be a cinematic universe. References are fine. I think that with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it works best as like a cartoon usually. Just the franchise itself, it seems to go through like this period where it's like has some moderate success for 5 years, and then it goes dormant for like 2 or 3 years, completely reboots, and then has like another success. That's kind of been the trend, especially with the movies.
Yeah, and it's great because what it does too is I don't think there's been a generation since the 80s that hasn't had their Ninja Turtles.
Right, and they all have like their own distinct flavors to it and everything. Even though they're broadly the same, they all have like different influences like worming their way throughout.
Yeah, and you know what? And even if we don't get a new movie in the next like 5 years, I'm sure we'll get one after that.
So earlier we were talking about too, like whether or not turtles are like considered more superhero or comic book based. I mean, they are parodies of superheroes, but they don't really feel like superheroes in that sense. It's more like a weird anime influence to them.
I think what's starting to happen, and it's it's always been true, is that superhero is a broad genre, and a lot of people, as we said this, we just said it, try to get that to conform to that Marvel Studios view of what a superhero is. I think Ninja Turtles are a big lesson in that's not always the case, and that when we approach these films, we shouldn't be approaching them from the same viewpoint. I think that's what killed all of that confounding moving around on Justice League, was trying to make all superheroes fit into a certain box, and Ninja Turtles is one of the ones that you're not going to get in that box. It's not a Marvel style story. It's something very different.
Fundamentally, too, there's an aspect of it that like superheroes like hide their identities. They're always hiding something, and like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles don't really have anything to hide besides their like entire bodies, I guess. But like, there's not that like dual identity thing going on either.
Right, but even I think that even that is sometimes overplayed. And like, look, and I'm not saying it's not present frequently, but I think it's one of the limiting things to how superheroes are portrayed outside of comics. I feel like comics do a pretty good job of having a breadth of different types of superheroes interacting with each other. Movies kind of like the same thing. Not that audiences necessarily do, but someone's got to pay for that script to be produced.
Right. I think that's also just like a Marvel thing too, where like Marvel kind of likes kind of making the same heroes over and over again, but they give each one like a little distinct flair, but that's about it.
Yeah, and let's clarify that. I think we're really more talking about the movies than anything else when we're talking about that. Obviously, the comics are always a touch more complex, if not wildly more complex. But I think even Ninja Turtles, even outside of comics, from its inception, has been different. I think that's what made it stand out when it first, caught huge popularity in the late 80s. And I think it's part of what continues to drive it, is that it never quite feels like a Captain America movie.
Right. It doesn't even feel like it's parodying it either, which is interesting because it did kind of start as a weird parody.
Yeah, but they found, like, that's where sometimes branding can be really good for you, right? Well, I think that brings us to the end of our discussion on the Ninja Turtles film franchise. If you're listening to a podcast about the Ninja Turtles, chances are you like toys. Please check out toystoreguide.com. A lot of businesses need your help these days. Dave over at toystoreguide.com has done a really great job of getting a lot of those stores in one place. Be sure to be patronizing your favorite comic book stores, even if that's online. Make sure these businesses survive. We're available all over the internet. We're on all sorts of social media. Just type us into Google. You'll find Dissecting Fiction just about everywhere relevant. And Vero. Plug us into Google. You'll find Dissecting Fiction. You'll find the website. You'll find our Apple Podcast page. You'll find whatever you would like to find. Christian, you have anything to add?
I'm looking forward to the new X-Men event. They announced that for the comic books in Marvel, and I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, yeah, the X of Swords or Swords?
10 of
X
Swords.
10 of Swords. Oh, see, now we're back on this again. But that brings our episode to a close this week. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And thanks for listening.